Hey everybody, it's Greg here from the Code Creative. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a lightweight yet powerful JavaScript framework called AlpineJS. AlpineJS offers us a lot of the same reactivity that we can get with larger, more complex frameworks like React or Vue. However, like I said, Alpine is much lighter, smaller in file size, and much easier to learn and deal with than Vue and React. Frameworks like React and Vue and Angular, for example, definitely have their places. But perhaps if you're building a smaller application or you just want to sprinkle some JavaScript functionality into your website, AlpineJS might be the perfect framework for you. We'll start out with a quick overview of AlpineJS just to get some of the basics under our fingertips, and then we'll build out a little to-do app so we can go further into some of the features of AlpineJS. Let's get going. By the way, if you're new here to the channel, we've got new videos coming all the time, so make sure you subscribe so you can take your coding skills to a higher and higher level every week. So before we get started building our to-do app, I think it'd be good to just take a little overview of AlpineJS just to get a couple of the concepts in place. So here I am on the AlpineJS.dev website, and here you can see AlpineJS is described as your new lightweight JavaScript framework. And here we get a little taste of how AlpineJS works. Let's take a moment and look at this example that they give us here so we can explore a couple of the concepts used in AlpineJS. As you can see on the first line here, it's very easy to get started with a simple script tag. And we'll look at installing and linking to Alpine with a CDN when we get into building our to-do app. But now let's take a look at some of the markup. And what you can see is that we have normal HTML elements like a div, a button, and a span. But then we embed AlpineJS directly in these elements through the use of what are called directives, such as here we see xData, xShow. And here we have this click with the @ symbol, which is also a directive, just with a slightly different syntax in this case. And if you're not familiar with the idea of directives, directives are basically attributes that we put inline in our HTML elements, and that serve to extend the elements. So then how does this xData directive extend the div element? Well, first of all, by simply using the xData directive on an element, we're declaring the element as an AlpineJS component. Furthermore, by using xData, we can now give this component some state. If you're familiar with something like React, for example, then you're familiar with this.state, right? So for a particular component, we say this.state equals an object, and then we give it certain properties which define that state. Well, we're basically doing the same thing here. We're saying xData equals this object, where we have a property of open set to a value of false. And this state is going to be scoped to this component, so this div. And that means that any element inside of this div, for example, here we have a button, and here we have a span, well, these elements that are nested inside of the div are going to have access to this state. So you can quickly see here on this button, for example, we're making reference to open, which lives on the state. We're also making reference to open here on the span, which lives on the state. So as we build out our simple to-do app, you're going to be getting more and more familiar with this, and you'll be learning a few other directives like xShow, for example, and this click directive here, which is an example of a directive that allows us to listen to an event on an element. And if we scroll down on the page, as you can see, simple is a keyword here. I believe that simplicity is at the core of the AlpineJS philosophy. And as you can see here on the left side, these directives, there's only 15 of them right now. And you can probably guess what a lot of them will be used for. Like this x4 will be used for iterating over a loop. And xif, for example, will be used for conditional statements. So now with that quick overview out of the way, let's get into building our app. I'm here in Visual Studio Code, which is my text editor, and I've got some really simple HTML boilerplate set up. And I'm keeping things just as simple as possible for the sake of this tutorial. So what we want to do first is we need to install AlpineJS, and as I mentioned previously, it's really simple. In order to do that, what we want to do is head over to the website, which is AlpineJS.dev, and here on the right we can go to the docs. And right here in the Start Here section, I'm simply going to copy the script tag. Then I'm going to come back to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that script tag inside the head of my HTML document. Now if I save and go to the browser, I've got my HTML page opened here with Live Server. And if I go in the console, and I type Alpine, I can see that it's in fact installed. Here we're at version 3.5.2. Now, when you're building out an app, it's often a good idea to start off with a simple roadmap or a list of the features that we'd like to put into the app. So let's actually create a new file in our project, and we'll just call it notes.txt. This will be a simple text file. And in here, we can create some notes about what we'd like our app to do. And we'll think about it in terms of our user. So let's say for our to-do app, a user will say should be able to add a to-do. Right, so that's the first bit of functionality that we know we're going to have to implement. And then as that user is inputting those to-dos, we want those to-dos to be outputted on the screen in the form of a list. So let's say user should be able to see a list of to-dos. Let's also say that a user should be able to delete a to-do, and a user should be able to mark a to-do as complete. Maybe we'd also like the user to be able to clear the entire list of to-dos. So we'll say a user should be able to clear the entire list of to-dos. And finally, let's also display the number of to-dos in the list, as well as keep track of how many of those to-dos have been completed. So let's just say a user should be able to see the number of to-dos and the number of completed to-dos. Now, of course, there's further functionality that could be included in this app, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to stick to this feature list. And now that we know what we want our app to be able to do, no pun intended, let's get to it. So let's start out by tackling this first requirement. The user should be able to add a to-do. So in thinking about this, in order for a user to add a to-do, what we're going to need is an input field so the user can actually type their to-do in. And then we're also going to want a button that the user can click in order to add that to-do to the list. And we're also going to want to set up some state in order to get hold of that user input, as well as to store those to-dos. As you're going to see in a moment, we're going to store our to-dos simply in an array. So we're not going to be persisting the to-dos in this tutorial, for example, with a database or with local storage, although that's certainly something you can do on your own if you want to take this app further and perhaps make it part of your project portfolio, for example. So let's go ahead then, and in the body tags of our HTML, let's first create that div, which is going to be the parent div. And this is the div that's going to hold the state for this component. Remember, we make it an AlpineJS component by giving it the xData directive. And in our case, since we want to create some state, let's set xData equal to an object, which we're going to put in quotation marks here. And we're going to create a property called todos, and this is going to be an array. It's going to start off simply as an empty array. And we'll create a property called user input, and we'll initialize this to an empty string to start off with. Inside of our div, let's create an input, and let's also create a button. For the input, let's use the placeholder attribute. And let's say enter to-do item. And let's give that button some text content. We'll simply say add. So let's save and go to the browser and see what we have so far. And there you can see our input with the placeholder and our add button. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to nest this input and the button inside of a form element, and we're not going to use the action attribute here. And the reason I'm putting these elements inside of a form is because this will give us some free functionality, which is that the user will also be able to use the return key on the keyboard to add the to-do, in addition to actually clicking on the button. I'm going to introduce a directive now called xModel, and we're going to place this directive on the input element. And we're going to set xModel equal to user input. And notice that user input is a property on our state. So what xModel is going to do for us is it's going to allow us to get the input from the user and to update our state with that input. And then we can take that input, and as you'll see in a moment, we're going to push that input into our to-dos array. So basically with xModel, we can do two-way data binding. In order to see what this means, let's temporarily create another element, which will be a p or a paragraph tag. And we're going to use another directive on this paragraph tag, which is called xText. And what xText is used for is to set the text content of an element. So here I can set xText equal to user input. So now what should happen is that with the two-way data binding that xModel gives us, when the user types in their to-do into the input field, that's going to update the value of user input. And then because we've set up this xtext directive here on this paragraph element, and we've assigned it to user input, the value of the state is going to be reflected back to us in the view, and we're going to see that user input displayed on the screen. So let's save, and let's give it a try in the browser. So let's see, what's something I want to do today? How about eat food? Well, there you can see, as I type in characters, the state is being updated, and that paragraph tag is displaying that state to us here in the view. So here, as I keep typing, you can see that the state is updated. But now coming back to our code, we don't want to simply output this user input to the screen. What we want to do with the user input is we want to push it into the to-dos array. So let's go ahead and set that up. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to want to listen for a click event on the button so that when the user clicks the add button, we can take the user input from the input field and push it into that to-dos array. So now let's introduce another directive, and this one is going to be used for events. In this case, we want to listen for a click event, and this is how we do it with AlpineJS. We do x-on followed by a colon, and then we put the name of the event that we want to listen for, in this case, the click event. And of course, there's many events that we can listen for, like a mouse over, a mouse leave, a key up, and so on and so forth. So you would put the name of whichever event you want to listen for after the colon. But we're listening for a click, so let's go ahead and set this equal to. We'll open up a pair of quotation marks, and then inside of these quotation marks, we can put any JavaScript that we want. So remember, since this form and this button element are nested inside of this outer div, we have access to the state. So we can say on click, we want to take that to-dos array and we want to push into it. And actually what we're going to push inside of the to-dos array is going to be an object. And you'll see why in just a second. So the objects that we want to push inside of the to-dos array are going to have a name property, which will represent the name of the to-do, and that's going to have a value of whatever the user input is. And now the reason we're using an object here is because I want to also give this a completed property, which is going to be initialized to a value of false. So you remember from our requirements, one of them was that we wanted to be able to, or we wanted the user to be able to mark a to-do as complete. And so that's why we want to keep track of the completed state for each of these to-dos. Now that we've set up the ability for the user to input their to-do and add it to a list, let's go back to our notes and let's look at the next requirement, which says the user should be able to see a list of to-dos. So let's go back to our HTML and figure out how we can do that. Since our to-do objects are getting pushed into this to-dos array, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need some way to iterate over those to-do objects and output them to the screen. So let me show you how to do that with AlpineJS. In order to iterate over the elements in an array, we're going to use another directive, and this is called x4. Now here's a key thing when using x4. In order to use x4, we're going to need to use it with a template element. So once we create that template element, let's add our x4 directive, and here's where we're going to set up our loop. We can say x4 to-do in to-dos. The to-dos, of course, is referring to this to-dos array on our state, and we're using to-do singular here to refer to each iteration over the to-dos array. So now to output these to-dos to the view, let's create a span element, and we'll use a directive that we looked at previously, and it's called xtext. And what are we going to set it to? Well, we want to see the name of the to-do. So let's say to-do.name. And now if we save and go back to the browser, let's give it a shot. Let's say our first to-do is going to be eat. So let's type in eat, and then when I click add, well, you see what happened there. We saw eat for just a very second on the screen, but then it disappeared. Let's try that one more time. Let's say our to-do is going to be shower. Click add. See it just momentarily, and then it disappears. And if you've worked with form elements before, you probably know that the default behavior when submitting a form is that the form submission will try to direct us to another URL to submit the form data. But in order to prevent that, we need to call prevent default. And so here's going to give me another opportunity to introduce another concept in AlpineJS to you. And this is the concept of modifiers. So first of all, on the form element itself, let's say we want to listen to the submit event, but we want to call prevent default on that submit event. So AlpineJS has a nice shortcut to do that. And that's simply to use a modifier, which we can do like so. We can say dot prevent. And now we should be able to prevent that default form submission behavior. So let's save, and now let's try it. And if I say eat and add, now you can see it stays in the view. And let's add one more. Let's say shower. And you can see it to get added here, but of course we're using all spans, so that's why it appears in line. And we don't want to eat shower. So that's simply a fix we need to do in our HTML markup. So what we're going to do is we're going to nest this span inside of a div. And now each new to-do should appear on its own line. So let's give it a shot one more time. Eat, shower, and let's say wash clothes. Now there is a reason why I did set up this element as a span initially, and that's because for each of these to-dos, I also want to display a checkbox, which is going to allow the user to mark the to-do as completed, as well as a button which the user can click on in order to delete the to-do. We can go ahead and set up those elements really quickly inside of this div. Let's make an input with the type of checkbox. We'll get rid of the name and ID for now. And then after that span, let's create a button element. And we're going to give it some text content. We're just going to use the X character here. And we want the user to be able to delete the to-do when they click on this button. So let's save and see what we have so far. If I type in a to-do and then click add, here we can see our input with type checkbox, as well as our delete button here. And we'll get those elements for every to-do that we add. Just to stay organized, let's go and take a look at our notes again. So this one should be able to add a to-do. Let's mark this with an asterisk, which will let us know that we've taken care of this requirement. Should be able to see a list of to-dos. We did that. So now here we're working on this functionality. Should be able to delete a to-do and should be able to mark a to-do as complete. Let's go back to our HTML. And let's work now on implementing that functionality so the user can delete a to-do or mark a to-do as completed. First, let's set up the ability to delete a to-do. So as we said, if I enter a to-do and I click on this button, I want this to-do to be deleted. So of course we need to listen for a click event on this button. And we've already learned how to do that here, remember, with this add to-do button. So let's come here to this delete button and we can say x on :click equals, then we'll open up a pair of quotation marks, and here we can write our JavaScript in order to delete our to-do from the to-dos array. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to filter the to-dos array and return only the to-dos that aren't equal to the current to-do, which is the one that the user is going to be clicking the delete button on. So let's take the to-dos from the state, and we're going to set it equal to todos.filter. And let's say as we're iterating, we'll call the current to-do, we'll just call it cur to-do. And we'll say only return cur to-do or current to-do if it's not equal to to-do. And to-do is going to be unique for each iteration, right? It's going to be the current to-do object for that particular iteration. So let's see if this works. Let's add our to-do again. And let's click on the X, and it disappears. And just to make sure it's actually deleting the correct to-do, let's add a couple of them. Wash clothes. Say take shower. And let's just delete wash clothes. Let's delete eat and take shower. Now here's something nice that you can do with the xon directive. There's a shorthand that you can use, which will replace all 5 of these characters. And that shortcut is just using the @ symbol like that. So this will do exactly the same thing as this. And just to confirm, yep, it still works. Let's add just a couple minor things now that'll make the user experience a little bit nicer. So notice, for example, if I get rid of this and let's add a to-do again, let's say wash clothes. Notice that after I click the add button, the to-do gets added, but it still remains in the input field. So what would be nice would be to clear out the input field once the to-do has been added to the list. So in order to do that, we can come into our button element, and inside of our quotation marks, once we're finished pushing the object into the to-dos array, let's write a semicolon, And let's say the user input is going to equal an empty string. So essentially this is going to reinitialize or reset the user input back to that empty string that it started out as here. And notice that we're taking advantage of the fact that in JavaScript you can use both single quotes and double quotes. So since we're putting all of our JavaScript inside of these double quotes, we're using single quotes here as the value of user input. So let's try that again. Let's do wash close, and then let's add it. And you can see it gets added to the list, but no longer appears in the input field. The other thing that would be nice would be to have this cursor turn into a pointer when the user hovers over the delete button. So in the spirit of keeping things simple, let's add a class to this button element. Let's call it delete. And then in our head section, let's create some style tags right here. And let's create a delete class along with the hover pseudo class. And we'll say cursor pointer. So now when the user hovers over the delete button, we get a pointer cursor. Another thing I'd like to do is set up some conditions for the adding of to-dos to the list. So let me refresh the page, and notice now I haven't entered anything into the input field. However, I can still click add, and you can see it's just adding empty to-dos to the list. So that's one thing that I don't want to have happen. And then another thing I want to prevent is the situation where the user maybe just enters some spaces like that, and then clicks add. And again, we're just getting an empty to-do in the list. So in order to prevent that, let's come into that button element, and this is where we're pushing our to-dos into the to-dos array. And like I said, we can write any JavaScript here inside of these double quotes. So let's set up a condition where we say, first of all, if user input dot length is greater than 0, only then will we actually push the to-do into the array. So if we go back and we try it now, and we currently have nothing here in the input field, if we click add, you can see now nothing gets added to the to-dos array. However, if I start typing some stuff here, now we can add it. As a shortcut, we can simply say if user input.length, because if the user input length is greater than 0, it'll evaluate to true. So that works, but if there's nothing in here, it won't get added. However, currently a user could enter some spaces and then click add. So to avoid that situation, we can use a method in JavaScript which is called trim, and this will remove any whitespace characters from the beginning or the end of a string. So we'll say if user input.trim, and we'll invoke it, and then we'll say if the length of that, the trim version of the user input, is greater than 0, only then will we actually push the to-do into the array. So we currently have nothing. We can't add anything. We do some spaces. We still can't add anything. But now if we put eat, it adds it. Cool. At this point, I think we should go back to our notes.txt file. And I think we can say that should be able to delete a to-do is now finished. So let's give it an asterisk. In a second, we'll tackle should be able to mark a to-do as complete. But before we do that, I think this one should be able to clear the entire list of to-dos. Will probably be pretty easy for us to implement next. Let's go back to our index.html file. And actually, before we do that, notice that this line, for example, is getting pretty long. So we could put some of this JavaScript on a new line like that. So we said we want the user to be able to clear the entire list of to-dos. And that's pretty easy to do. Essentially, all we have to do is reset the to-dos array to an empty array, as it was initially. To do that, let's make a button. We'll come in here under the template, and let's just say clear all, and this is what it looks like. And so at this point, with what you've learned so far about AlpineJS, you should know exactly how to do this. We want to listen for a click event on the button, so let's use our shorthand with the @ symbol. We'll say @click, and we'll open up a pair of quotation marks. And all we have to do here is say to-dos equals an empty array. And again, remember this button element, it's nested inside of this div, which has the xData directive with the state. So to-dos is available to us in this button element. So let's give it a shot. Let's once again add our favorite to-dos. Eat, wash, clothes, and shower. And notice right there, you didn't see me click the add button because I was hitting the return key on the keyboard. Now if I come in here and click clear all the to-dos disappear, as that to-dos array is reinitialized to an empty array. Now when our app starts out, it's a little awkward for the user to see a clear all button when no to-dos exist yet. So let's bring in another directive, which we haven't seen yet, and this one is called xShow. And what this xShow directive is going to do is it's going to allow us to conditionally display or hide the element from the view. And that element in this case is this button. So let's come into the button element, let's give it the xShow directive, and basically what we want to do is we only want to show this clear all button when there are some to-dos in the array. And we'd know there are to-dos in the array when the to-dos.length is greater than 0. And once again, we can simplify this to just to-dos.length. So now let's go back to the browser, and here's our starting point in the application. We don't see the clear all button because we don't have any to-dos yet. But now once I start adding some, eat, you can see the clear all button shows up. Shower. All right, so we're only showing this clear all button when some to-dos have appeared in our list. And what the xShow directive is really doing is changing the CSS display property to none if the condition is falsy, which it would be if to-dos.length equals 0. Once again, let's go back to our notes file, and let's put an asterisk by should be able to clear the entire list of to-dos. We can now move on to should be able to mark a to-do as complete. So let's get to it. As you can see currently, when we add a to-do, our checkbox input is unchecked. And what we want to do is we want to mark this to-do as complete when the user checks this input. We're going to mark it complete by using a CSS property called text decoration, which we're going to give a value of line through to. That's going to create a line through the text to indicate that it's completed. So let's go back to our index.html and see how we can do this. What we're going to do on this checkbox input, we're going to once again make use of that xModel directive. And remember, with xModel, we can do two-way data binding. In this case, we're going to set xModel equal to to-do.completed. Now remember, the completed property for a to-do, it's initialized to false. So if we save and we enter a to-do again, we can see that currently the checkbox input is unchecked. However, once we check that checkbox, to-do.completed is now going to update in the state to a value of true. And what we can do with that is we can dynamically add a class to our span, which has that to-do name. In order to do this, we're going to learn a new directive, and this one is called xBind. And because we want to dynamically apply a class to this span, we'll say xBind : class. And then we can set that equal to a JavaScript expression. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to put an object in these quotation marks, and we're going to say apply a class called completed, which we haven't created yet, but we will in a second. Apply that only when to-do.completed equals true. Or to simplify, we can just say to-do.completed. So let's come up into our style tags, and let's make that completed class. And as we said, that completed class is going to have text decoration set to line through. So now let's go try it out. We add our to-do, and then if we check the checkbox, you see that line through being applied to the to-do. Perfect. And we can uncheck the box to toggle that effect. And let's try a couple more. And let's say eat is completed and wash clothes is completed. And just for pure joy, let's clear all. Just as we had a shorthand for this X on click, where we use the @ symbol in click, there's also a shorthand for xBind. And all we have to do here is actually just remove the xBind and simply leave the colon. So if we say :class, this should do exactly the same thing. So at this point, we can should be able to mark a to-do as complete as being done. And finally, we can move on to should be able to see the number of to-dos in the number of completed to-dos. First, let's simply tackle outputting the number of to-dos onto the screen. So back on our index.html file, let's come down under the button, and let's make a new div, and let's create a span. And to do this, we're not going to introduce any new directives, because we can use xtext here. So we can say xtext is going to equal what? Well, we can get the number of to-dos by using to-dos.length. So let's go see it in the browser. So to-dos currently is empty starting out, which is why we see 0. Let's add a to-do. And now we see that number increase to 1. Let's add another one. And it goes up to 2. And now 3, and so on and so forth. But now we want to also say, out of the to-dos in our list, how many are currently completed. So for example, if I was to mark this one as complete, I'd want to see 1 out of 3 are complete. Let's go ahead and do it. What we're going to do is we're going to create another span, and we want this one to show the number of to-dos that are currently completed. So again, let's use our xtext directive, and we'll write some JavaScript. To find the number of to-dos completed, let's use the filter method on the to-dos array, and let's say for each to-do in that array, if that to-do.completed property is true, or simply to-do.completed, then we'll return that to-do, and then we can simply use the length property of that new array that's returned from the filter method. Now, I want to separate this number from the total number of to-dos. So after the span, let's put in a /, and then at the end of the second span, let's say to-dos completed. And let's go and take a look. And here we can see we're starting out with 0 out of 0 to-dos completed. So let's go ahead and add some to-dos to our array. Let's say eat, take shower, wash clothes. And here we can see we have 3 to-dos total, but 0 out of the 3 to-dos have been completed, right? But now check out how this first number will increment when we mark to-dos as completed. So let's mark eat as completed. Now we see 1 out of 3 to-dos completed. Now we have 2 out of 3 and 3 out of 3. And we can still delete items. If we uncheck some of them, like let's uncheck the second one, we can see the number of to-dos completed has been updated, and we can clear all to get rid of all of them. 0 out of 0 to-dos completed. At this point, just to make ourselves happy, let's go back to our notes.txt file, give ourselves a happy asterisk on that last requirement that we had to do, and we can see we've completed everything we set out to do. One more thing to note is that the documentation says that when you are doing a for loop, like this here, you also want to create a key, something like this, where you would say something like todo.id. And for the sake of simplicity, we didn't give an ID to our to-dos, but if we wanted to have a key on our to-do objects, we could have included an ID property like this, and somehow we would give each one of our to-do objects a unique ID. According to the documentation, Alpine says without dynamic keys, it might have a difficult time keeping track of these items when they're reordered. So just something to note. There's a lot more that you can do with AlpineJS, and at this point you could take it as a challenge to add some further functionality to this application. For example, you could add the ability to edit your to-dos in the list. Also, you could add some functionality that would allow you to filter the to-dos in your list. Like for example, you could filter between all your to-dos, only the to-dos that have been completed, and only the to-dos that haven't been completed. Now, if you feel like you got some value out of this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop me a comment down below and let me know if you'd like to see more videos on AlpineJS. Oh yeah, one more thing. In the section down below, I'm going to leave a link so you can join the Code Creative Facebook group. I'm also going to leave a link so you can download my free Google Search Tips for Developers cheat sheet. See you next time.